They believed power was permanent. History knew better. At dawn on a quiet July morning in 1945, the desert of New Mexico held its breath. A single flash, brighter than the sun, tore the sky apart. In that instant, the United States of America crossed a threshold no empire before it had ever crossed. The ground trembled, mountains echoed, and far beyond that empty desert, the future of global power was sealed in fire. America had arrived at the summit of human history. What no one standing there truly understood was this: the same forces that lift nations to unimaginable heights also begin, silently and patiently, the work of pulling them down. This is the story of how American power rose, brilliant, terrifying, and unmatched, and how it slowly began to fracture under the weight of its own success. The United States was not born powerful, it was born angry. In the late 18th century, the land that would one day dominate the world was a scattered collection of colonies clinging to the Atlantic edge of a vast, hostile continent. Britain ruled them not with affection, but with calculation. Taxes without representation, laws without consent, soldiers quartered in private homes. For decades, resentment simmered quietly in taverns, churches, and print shops. Power at that time belonged to empires. Britain, France, Spain, these were the masters of oceans and armies. The American colonists were farmers, traders, printers, and smugglers. They had no standing army worthy of the name, no navy to speak of, no tradition of sovereignty. What they had instead was something far more dangerous. They had belief. The belief that power did not flow downward from kings, but upward from ordinary people. The belief that authority could be challenged. The belief that history itself could be rewritten by those bold or reckless enough to try. When war finally came in 1775, it was not a clash of equals, it was an experiment, and experiments often fail. American soldiers froze at Valley Forge, they starved, they deserted. The Continental Congress argued endlessly while British cannons shattered cities. George Washington himself doubted, privately, whether the rebellion could survive another winter. But something strange happened as the war dragged on. The British, confident in their superiority, underestimated the sheer stubbornness of a people fighting on their own land. Every defeat hardened American resolve. Every atrocity fed the narrative of tyranny. And every small victory, Lexington, Concord, Saratoga, expanded the idea that the impossible might be possible. When France joined the war, the balance shifted. Power is rarely moral, it is strategic. France did not aid America out of love for liberty, but out of hatred for Britain. Yet the result was the same. In 1783, the British Empire conceded defeat. A republic had been born. But victory brought a new problem, one more dangerous than British armies. What does a nation do after revolution? The founders understood something crucial. Power without limits destroys itself. They had seen it in monarchies. They had felt it in colonial rule. So they attempted something unprecedented, a system designed not to concentrate power, but to restrain it. Checks and balances, federalism, civil liberties, a constitution that assumed human weakness and tried to cage it. It was an extraordinary gamble. For a time, it worked. The young republic expanded cautiously at first, then hungrily. Land meant opportunity. Opportunity meant population. Population meant production. And production, slowly but inevitably, meant power. By the mid-19th century, America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a continental force. Railroads stitched the land together. Factories roared. Cities rose. Immigrants poured in from Europe, carrying desperation, ambition, and labor. Yet beneath this growth lay a contradiction so deep it would nearly tear the nation apart. Slavery. The same nation that spoke of liberty in universal terms had built much of its wealth on human bondage. The contradiction was not philosophical, it was economic, political, and violently real. Southern power depended on enslaved labor. Northern power increasingly depended on industry. Both sides claimed the legacy of the revolution. Both insisted history was on their side. When compromise finally failed, the result was the bloodiest conflict America would ever know. The Civil War was not merely a struggle to preserve the Union. It was a trial by fire, testing whether a democratic nation could survive internal fracture. Over 600,000 Americans died. Cities burned. Families split. The federal government expanded its authority in ways previously unimaginable. And when the war ended, something fundamental had changed. The United States emerged unified, industrialized, and hardened. The federal government was no longer a fragile referee, it was a central force. War taught America how to mobilize resources, control economies, and project authority over vast distances. Power, once feared, was now understood as necessary. The late 19th century saw America step onto the global stage, not as an empire by name, but increasingly by behavior. The Spanish-American War was short, decisive, and revealing. In defeating Spain, the United States acquired overseas territories, foreign bases, and a taste for intervention beyond its borders. Officially, America rejected empire. Unofficially, it embraced influence. By the early 20th century, American factories outproduced Europe's. Its oil fueled machines, its banks financed growth. While old empires staggered under the weight of tradition and exhaustion, America thrived on innovation and scale. Then came World War I. The war shattered Europe. Empires collapsed. Millions died. And when the guns fell silent, the United States stood richer, stronger, and more intact than any major power on Earth. Yet America hesitated. Scarred by war, distrustful of entanglements, it withdrew inward. Power, unused, does not disappear, but it does reshape itself. During the interwar years, America grew economically dominant while remaining politically aloof. That illusion would not last. World War II changed everything. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered the war not as a hesitant participant, but as an industrial titan. American factories became the arsenal of democracy. Tanks, planes, ships, produced at a scale no nation had ever achieved. The war transformed the American state. The economy was mobilized, science fused with military ambition, and when the war ended, two truths stood undeniable. Europe was broken. America was not. In the ashes of war, the United States rebuilt the world in its own image. The Marshall Plan stabilized economies. The dollar became global currency. American military bases encircled the planet. Hollywood exported culture. Corporations exported consumption. Universities exported ideology. And then there was the bomb. Nuclear weapons did not merely end wars, they redefined power itself. For the first time, humanity possessed the means to annihilate itself entirely. America had built the weapon, and in doing so, assumed responsibility for a terrifying new world. The Cold War was not fought with constant gunfire, but with pressure, fear, and influence. Two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, faced each other across continents and ideologies. America championed freedom, markets, and democracy. It also supported dictators, overthrew governments, and waged proxy wars. Power demanded choices. Choices demanded compromise, and compromise left scars. Vietnam was one such scar. The war exposed the limits of military might. Technology could not defeat nationalism. Firepower could not erase doubt. When American helicopters lifted off from Saigon in 1975, they carried not just soldiers, but innocents. For the first time, Americans openly questioned whether power always brought progress. Still, the Cold War ended, apparently, with victory. The Soviet Union collapsed, communism retreated, America stood alone, unrivaled. The 1990s felt like the end of history. Globalization spread American systems worldwide, markets opened, democracies multiplied. The Internet, largely American in architecture, connected the planet. Power had never been so absolute. And absolute power, history warns, is most dangerous when it feels unquestioned. The attacks of September 11, 2001 shattered the illusion of invulnerability. The response was swift, overwhelming, and costly. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq extended American power militarily, but strained it politically, economically, and morally. Trillions spent. Trust eroded. Institutions polarized. Allies questioned. Rivals watched and learned. Power was no longer simply about armies and money. It was about narratives, technology, and internal cohesion. By the early 21st century, cracks appeared. Economic inequality widened, political divisions hardened, confidence in institutions weakened. While America remained powerful, it was no longer uncontested. China rose quietly but steadily. Russia probed for weakness. The world became multipolar, complex, and unstable. Empires rarely collapse overnight. They erode through complacency, through overreach, through forgetting the principles that once justified their rise. The United States still commands immense power. Its military remains unmatched. Its culture still shapes dreams. Its innovations still define the future. But history does not care about past glory. It only asks one question, again and again. Can power adapt, or will it break under its own weight? The answer, as always, is still being written.
The erosion did not announce itself with collapse or conquest. It arrived quietly, disguised as normalcy. At the turn of the 21st century, American power appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. Satellites orbited the planet bearing American technology. Financial markets moved at the rhythm of Wall Street. English, inflected with American slang, became the default language of commerce, science, and the Internet. No empire in history had ever shaped daily life so invisibly, so completely. And yet, beneath this dominance, the foundations were shifting. Power, once external, measured in battles won and territories controlled, was turning inward. The greatest threats to American strength were no longer foreign armies massing at borders, but internal fractures growing deeper with each passing year. After the Cold War, America lost something it had relied on for half a century, a clear enemy. The Soviet Union had provided more than opposition. It had provided purpose. Containment gave coherence to foreign policy. Anti-communism unified politics. Sacrifice felt justified because it was framed as existential. With that rival gone, American power drifted. Globalization accelerated, driven by American corporations and financial institutions. Manufacturing moved overseas in search of cheaper labor. Profits rose, stock markets soared, but entire communities hollowed out. Towns built around factories withered, jobs vanished, promises of retraining and opportunity often failed to materialize. For the first time in generations, millions of Americans felt the future shrinking rather than expanding. Inequality widened, not just in income but in experience. Coastal cities thrived. Financial and technological elites accumulated influence unimaginable in earlier eras. Meanwhile, rural regions and former industrial centers sank into decline, their anger growing, their trust eroding.
power was concentrating again, exactly what the founders had feared. The attacks of September 11th did not create this tension, but they exposed it. In the immediate aftermath, American unity surged. Flags appeared on porches and cars. Approval ratings soared. The language of sacrifice returned. Once more, power seemed moral, necessary, righteous. But the wars that followed stretched that unity thin. Afghanistan was framed as a just response, a direct strike against those responsible. Iraq was something else entirely. Intelligence was bent, fear was amplified. The language of certainty replaced the humility of doubt. When weapons of mass destruction failed to appear, credibility collapsed. America still possessed overwhelming force, but legitimacy, far harder to rebuild, was slipping away. Abu Ghraib photographs circulated globally. Civilian casualties filled screens. Allies hesitated. Adversaries adapted. Insurgency replaced conventional warfare. Victory became undefined. At home, the costs mounted. Veterans returned with visible and invisible wounds. Trillions of dollars vanished into distant deserts. Infrastructure aged. Schools struggled. Healthcare costs exploded. The empire was paying interest on borrowed power. Then came 2008. The financial crisis did not merely shake markets, it shattered belief. The very institutions that claimed to manage risk had created catastrophe. Banks were rescued, ordinary Americans were not. Homes were lost, savings disappeared, careers ended overnight. For many, the American dream did not just feel distant, it felt fraudulent. Power in that moment revealed its true allegiance. Anger replaced optimism. Trust in elites collapsed. Conspiracy filled the vacuum where credibility once lived. Politics hardened into identity warfare. Facts became negotiable. Compromise became betrayal. Technology accelerated everything. Social media flattened authority while amplifying outrage. Algorithms rewarded division. Foreign actors learned to exploit open systems. Information became a battlefield, and America's greatest strength, its openness, became a vulnerability. Meanwhile, rivals studied carefully. China did not challenge American power with ideology alone. It challenged it with patience, infrastructure, manufacturing dominance, strategic investments. While America debated, China built. Russia, weaker economically, leaned into disruption, cyber attacks, disinformation, election interference, not to conquer, but to destabilize. Power was no longer about winning wars, it was about eroding cohesion. Internally, the United States began to resemble something unrecognizable. Political violence returned to headlines. Institutions once respected were openly doubted. The Supreme Court, Congress, even elections themselves became contested terrain. The peaceful transfer of power, once America's proudest tradition, was suddenly fragile. History offers a cruel lesson. Nations rarely fall because they are defeated from without. They fall when they can no longer agree on who they are. Yet, decline is not destiny. American history is not a straight line upward or downward. It is cyclical, violent, self-correcting, and unfinished. The same nation that tolerated slavery abolished it. The same system that excluded women enfranchised them. The same society that persecuted minorities has repeatedly been forced to confront itself. Power, when examined honestly, has always been America's paradox. Its rise was fueled by ideals it frequently violated. Its dominance sustained by institutions it often undermined. Its future dependent on choices still being argued, protested, voted for, and fought over. Empires of the past fell because they could not adapt fast enough to changing realities. America's challenge is different. It must decide whether power exists to preserve privilege
or to renew possibility. The world is watching, not because America is perfect, but because it remains influential. What America chooses to reform, to retreat, to harden, or to reinvent will shape not just its own fate, but the architecture of the century ahead. The flash in the New Mexico desert marked the moment America reached the summit. What follows now is the far harder test, whether it can descend without destroying itself, and whether in the process it can remember why it climbed at all.
History does not pause to ask whether a nation is tired. It keeps moving. As the third decade of the 21st century unfolded, the United States entered an era that felt unfamiliar even to those who had lived through wars and recessions. The language of crisis became permanent. Every election was framed as the last. Every disagreement felt existential. The center, once crowded, messy, and functional, emptied out. Power, increasingly, was no longer about governing. It was about winning. The federal government still commanded the world's most powerful military, yet struggled to pass budgets on time. It could deploy aircraft carriers across oceans, but could not agree on basic facts at home. The machinery of the state remained vast, but its moral authority thinned. This was not collapse. It was something slower, more corrosive: stagnation. America's institutions were designed for conflict, but also for trust. When that trust eroded, gridlock hardened into paralysis. The Constitution assumed ambition would counter ambition. It did not fully account for a society in which ambition replaced restraint entirely. Meanwhile, the economy transformed again. Automation replaced labor. Artificial intelligence threatened professions once considered safe. Wealth concentrated further, flowing into assets rather than wages. Younger generations inherited debt instead of opportunity, insecurity instead of optimism. For the first time, the idea that each generation would live better than the last felt uncertain. Power began to feel abstract, visible on balance sheets, invisible in daily life. Globally, the American-led order frayed. Allies questioned reliability. Trade became weaponized. Institutions built after World War II struggled to function in a world no longer dominated by a single power. The United States still shaped outcomes, but no longer dictated them. China's rise was no longer theoretical. It manifested in ports, supply chains, satellites, and standards. Influence followed infrastructure. While America debated values, China offered speed. While Washington argued process, Beijing delivered projects. Neither model was clean. Neither was free of contradiction, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. The world was no longer waiting for American leadership. It was hedging against its absence. At home, culture became a battleground. Education, history, identity, everything was contested. Even memory itself fractured. Different Americans lived in different realities, consuming different truths, fearing different futures. Empires decay when shared narratives collapse. What does it mean to be American? The question, once answered imperfectly but collectively, now splintered into competing visions. Freedom meant different things to different people. Justice meant opposite outcomes. Patriotism itself became suspect or weaponized. Yet beneath the noise, another current moved. Quietly, persistently, Americans continued to build. Scientists pushed boundaries. Entrepreneurs created. Local communities adapted. Immigrants still arrived, drawn by a promise that refused to die.
The country's greatest strength, its capacity for reinvention, remained alive, though obscured. History has always been unkind to predictions of American decline because it underestimates one thing. Instability has never been an anomaly in the American story. It has been the norm. The Revolution was chaos. The Civil War was catastrophe. The Great Depression was despair. Each time the nation emerged changed, scarred but redefined. The danger now was not division itself, but exhaustion, cynicism, the belief that renewal was impossible. That belief, more than any foreign rival, threatened American power. Because power, at its core, is not weapons or wealth, it is belief. Belief that institutions can be repaired. Belief that participation matters. Belief that the future can be shaped rather than endured. Empires fall when belief dies. The United States had reached a moment of choice, not dramatic, not cinematic, but decisive. Reform or drift, renewal or resentment, engagement or retreat. History would not judge America by whether it remained dominant. It would judge whether it remained democratic, whether it could align power with principle once more, whether it could accept limits without surrender, whether it could transform without tearing itself apart. The rise of American power was forged in rebellion against inherited authority. Its decline, if it comes, will arrive not with invasion, but with indifference. And its survival will depend on something far harder than conquest: the courage to look inward, to remember its unfinished promises, and to begin again, not as an empire seeking permanence, but as a republic willing to earn its future.
The future, when it arrived, did not look like the fantasies of collapse or conquest that once dominated headlines. It looked ordinary. That was its most unsettling feature. No flags burned permanently in the streets. No foreign armies marched across American cities. Instead, life continued. Workdays, elections, arguments, markets opening and closing, while something less visible but more decisive unfolded beneath the surface: adaptation. Power, history shows, does not vanish, it migrates. By the mid-21st century, the United States no longer defined the world alone. Influence was shared, contested, fragmented across regions and networks, but America remained embedded in nearly every system that mattered: finance, technology, culture, security. This was not the fall of Rome. It was something new, a recalibration. The American military shifted from dominance to deterrence, from permanent war to strategic restraint. Costly interventions faded. Alliances mattered again, not as tools, but as necessities. Power became cooperative or ineffective. Economic strength followed a similar path. Supply chains shortened. Domestic production returned in targeted sectors, not out of nostalgia, but survival. Energy transitions reshaped geopolitics. Innovation once again became a national priority rather than a private luxury. The question was no longer whether America could outspend rivals. It was whether it could outlearn them. Internally, the reckoning continued. Democracy, long treated as an inheritance, was rediscovered as a responsibility. Voting systems were reformed unevenly, imperfectly, but persistently. Local governance regained relevance as national politics lost monopoly over meaning. Change did not arrive cleanly. It never does. Progress coexisted with backlash. Reforms sparked resistance. Every step forward reopened old wounds. But the process itself, the argument, the participation, the refusal to disengage, kept the system alive. History is filled with empires that mistook silence for stability. America, for all its noise, remained awake. Culturally, the nation slowly renegotiated its identity. The myth of homogeneity finally gave way to something closer to reality, a pluralistic, contested, dynamic society that no longer pretended unity was natural. Unity, it learned, had to be built. Education shifted from memorization to interpretation. History was no longer presented as triumph alone, but as struggle, not to diminish power, but to humanize it, because unexamined power repeats its mistakes. Globally, the United States became less preachy and more pragmatic. It still defended ideals, but with the humility earned by failure. Democracy promotion gave way to democracy partnership. Influence flowed through standards, research, and collaboration rather than coercion. The world remained dangerous. Crises did not disappear. Climate disruption, pandemics, technological shocks tested every nation. But America faced them not as a solitary empire, but as a central node in a crowded system. Power was no longer vertical, it was networked. This shift frustrated those who longed for clear hierarchies and unquestioned authority, but history had already closed that chapter. The age of unilateral dominance was an anomaly, brief, intense, and unsustainable. What endured was not supremacy, but relevance, and relevance required adaptability. The true measure of American power was never how high it climbed, but how often it corrected course. Unlike rigid empires, it possessed a mechanism rare in history, the capacity to self-criticize without immediate collapse. That capacity was strained, but it survived. In the end, the rise and fall of American power was not a single arc, but a series of reinventions, each responding to failure, fear, and opportunity. The story did not end with decline, nor did it conclude with triumph. It continued, as all meaningful histories do, unfinished, unresolved, and dependent on choices yet to be made. Because power, once achieved, is easy to display, but wisdom must be earned again and again by every generation that inherits what it did not build. And that, more than dominance or decline, is the true legacy of the American century.
Time moved forward, indifferent to arguments about greatness. What followed was not a dramatic resurrection nor a definitive collapse, but a long, uneven season of reckoning, one that tested whether the American experiment was capable of maturing beyond the mythology that had sustained it. For much of its history, the United States had relied on momentum. Expansion begat confidence. Confidence begat risk. Risk, more often than not, was rewarded. The frontier closed, but ambition replaced it. Industry surged, and when it stalled, war revived it. Each crisis had delivered renewal through force, scale, or speed. This time was different. There was no empty land to conquer, no shattered continent waiting to be rebuilt under American guidance. The challenges ahead were diffuse, abstract, and global. Climate instability ignored borders. Digital power dissolved geography. Economic shocks traveled faster than governments could respond. The old tools still existed, but they no longer guaranteed results. America's power entered a phase of negotiation with reality, with rivals, and most uncomfortably, with itself. Generational change accelerated that negotiation. Those born after the Cold War carried no memory of existential foreign threats. Their battles were internal: debt, housing, healthcare, meaning. They inherited institutions designed for a different century and questioned why those systems seemed unable or unwilling to serve them. This questioning unsettled older assumptions. Loyalty to institutions once flowed naturally. Now it had to be justified. Authority had to explain itself. That was dangerous. It was also necessary. Every durable republic eventually confronts the gap between its founding promises and lived experience. For America, that gap had widened over decades of inequality, exclusion, and contradiction. Power had amplified the discrepancy, not erased it. And so the nation argued with itself relentlessly. Some saw reform as surrender. Others saw resistance as decay. Both sides believed they were saving the country. History offered no comfort here. Societies do not fracture because disagreements exist. They fracture when disagreement becomes incompatible with coexistence. The real test was not whether America could agree, it was whether it could disagree without destruction. Economic power shifted again, this time toward knowledge and adaptability rather than sheer scale. Education, long uneven, became central to national survival. Investment in research, infrastructure, and human capital no longer competed with military spending. It complemented it. Power slowly rebalanced. Not without resistance. Those who benefited from older arrangements fought change fiercely. Nostalgia hardened into ideology. The past became a weapon rather than a lesson. Calls to restore greatness often ignored the costs at which that greatness had been achieved and who had paid them. Empires fall fastest when they confuse memory with destiny. Yet amid the struggle, something persistent endured: participation. Turnout rose, local movements multiplied, civic engagement re-emerged not as duty but as defiance against apathy. Americans did not retreat from the system. They crowded it, contested it, strained it. That pressure hurt, but it also prevented stagnation. Internationally, American influence grew quieter but more credible. Instead of declaring leadership, it demonstrated it through crisis response, scientific collaboration, and institutional repair. Not every effort succeeded, many failed, but the posture shifted from command to contribution. Rivals adjusted accordingly. Competition remained fierce, but less ideological, more pragmatic. Power balanced itself through interdependence rather than confrontation alone. This did not make the world safer, it made it more honest. The myth of inevitable American decline never fully materialized, because decline was never linear. It surged and receded, tied to choices rather than fate. Likewise, the fantasy of permanent dominance faded, not in humiliation, but in recognition of limits. Limits, once acknowledged, became strengths. By accepting that it could not control everything, America relearned how to influence what mattered most. The Republic did not return to innocence, it returned to responsibility. And responsibility, unlike supremacy, is sustainable. The rise of American power had been fueled by expansion, confidence, and belief in exceptional destiny. Its transformation required humility, restraint, and renewed commitment to principles once taken for granted. History does not grant permanence, but it sometimes grants second chances. Whether America would fully seize that chance remained uncertain. The answer would appear not in speeches or statistics, but in quieter places, in classrooms, courtrooms, neighborhoods, and elections yet to come. Power would continue to ebb and flow. What mattered was whether the experiment itself endured, not as an empire commanding obedience, but as a republic capable of correction. That distinction, fragile, contested, unfinished, was the true measure of American power. And it remained, as it always had, unresolved.
What history rarely captures in clean lines is the cost of endurance. Survival is not heroic, It is exhausting. As the decades pressed on, the United States learned that remaining influential required something more demanding than dominance: consistency. The world no longer responded to declarations of leadership. It responded to reliability. Promises kept, norms respected, failures acknowledged. For a nation accustomed to defining eras, this quieter form of power felt unfamiliar, almost like loss. But influence, stripped of spectacle, often proves more durable. The American state recalibrated slowly, often clumsily. Grand strategies gave way to incremental ones. Policy became less visionary and more corrective. Mistakes were harder to conceal in a transparent, networked world, and credibility depended not on avoiding error, but on responding to it. This shift revealed a deeper truth. American power had never been singular. It had always been an ecosystem. Military strength mattered, but so did courts. Markets mattered, but so did norms. Technology mattered, but so did trust. When one element faltered, others compensated, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes just enough. The greatest test of this ecosystem came not from a single enemy, but from overlapping crises. Climate disruptions strained infrastructure and governance. Health emergencies exposed inequality and coordination failures. Financial shocks reminded citizens how interdependent prosperity truly was. None of these challenges could be defeated by force. They required competence. Competence, unlike charisma, does not inspire easily. It rebuilds quietly through institutions often taken for granted. Engineers, nurses, administrators, teachers, actors rarely celebrated in narratives of power. What history rarely captures in clean lines is the cost of endurance. Survival is not heroic, it is exhausting. As the decades pressed on, the United States learned that remaining influential required something more demanding than dominance: consistency. The world no longer responded to declarations of leadership. It responded to reliability. Promises kept, norms respected, failures acknowledged. For a nation accustomed to defining eras, this quieter form of power felt unfamiliar, almost like loss. But influence, stripped of spectacle, often proves more durable. The American state recalibrated slowly, often clumsily. Grand strategies gave way to incremental ones. Policy became less visionary and more corrective. Mistakes were harder to conceal in a transparent, networked world, and credibility depended not on avoiding error, but on responding to it. This shift revealed a deeper truth. American power had never been singular. It had always been an ecosystem. Military strength mattered, but so did courts. Markets mattered, but so did norms. Technology mattered, but so did trust. When one element faltered, others compensated, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes just enough. The greatest test of this ecosystem came not from a single enemy, but from overlapping crises. Climate disruptions strained infrastructure and governance. Health emergencies exposed inequality and coordination failures. Financial shocks reminded citizens how interdependent prosperity truly was. None of these challenges could be defeated by force. They required competence. Competence, unlike charisma, does not inspire easily. It rebuilds quietly through institutions often taken for granted. Engineers, nurses, administrators, teachers, actors rarely celebrated in narratives of power, became central to national resilience. The mythology of the lone savior faded. What replaced it was collective effort. This transition unsettled cultural expectations shaped by a century of triumph. Americans had learned to associate power with speed and scale. Now it was measured in durability. systems that bent without breaking, reforms that endured beyond election cycles. The Republic aged. Aging, however, did not mean irrelevance. Globally, other nations watched closely. Some expected collapse, others anticipated withdrawal. Instead, they saw adjustment, slower, more cautious, more constrained, but still present. American influence became conditional, earned through participation rather than presumed through history. This shift carried a lesson often ignored by empires. Legitimacy compounds. It grows slowly, erodes quickly, and once lost is painfully difficult to regain. America had lost some of it. Regaining even part required honesty about past overreach. It required acknowledging that power exercised without accountability breeds resistance, not order. This reckoning did not weaken the nation, it clarified it. Clarity is power. Internally, the debate over identity did not resolve neatly. It never had. What changed was recognition that disagreement itself was not failure. Suppression was. Pluralism, once treated as an obstacle to unity, re-emerged as its foundation. The country did not converge on a single story, but it relearned how to share space between competing ones. That coexistence was fragile, but fragility, handled with care, can be preserved. The long arc of American power revealed a paradox few founders could have predicted. The very openness that made the nation vulnerable to division, to interference, to self-doubt, also made it adaptable. Closed systems appeared strong until they shattered. Open ones appeared chaotic until they survived. History favored the latter more often than the former. By this stage, the language of rise and fall felt insufficient. What had occurred was neither ascent nor collapse, but transformation under pressure. Power had been redistributed, internally and globally, without disappearing. The United States was no longer the axis around which the world revolved, but it remained a force that shaped trajectories. That distinction mattered. Empires measure success by control. Republics measure it by continuity. The American experiment, flawed and frequently contradictory, continued not because it avoided mistakes, but because it retained the capacity to revise itself. That capacity was neither guaranteed nor permanent. It required vigilance, participation, and restraint, qualities difficult to sustain at scale. Yet they endured. The story of American power, then, was never a morality tale about inevitable decline or destined supremacy. It was a study in tension between ambition and accountability, confidence and humility, strength and restraint. And like all unresolved tensions, it demanded constant engagement. The future would not remember America for how loudly it declared leadership, nor for how fiercely it defended past dominance. It would remember whether it learned when to lead, when to listen, and when to change. Power, in the end, is not proven by how long it lasts unchanged. It is proven by how well it evolves without losing its core. That was the test America faced, not once, but endlessly. And the verdict, as history insisted, would never be final.
What remained after the fevered dreams of dominance had cooled was responsibility stripped of illusion. The United States entered this phase without ceremony. There was no declaration that an era had ended, no treaty marking transition. Power rarely announces its maturation. It simply behaves differently. Foreign policy became less about shaping the world and more about surviving within it. The language of inevitability vanished from speeches. Instead came contingency, risk management, acknowledgement of limits. This unsettled allies who once relied on American certainty and adversaries who once feared it. Certainty, after all, is intimidating. But adaptability endures longer. The country learned, slowly, that leadership in a fractured world required tolerance for ambiguity. Clear victories were rare. Trade-offs became permanent. Every decision created secondary consequences that reverberated through interconnected systems. The old playbooks failed more often than they succeeded. And so new ones emerged. Not grand doctrines, but frameworks. Not crusades, but coalitions. Power flowed through norms, standards, and coordination rather than force alone. The most consequential decisions were no longer televised moments of drama, but bureaucratic negotiations over data, climate thresholds, supply chains, and digital governance. This kind of power was invisible to many citizens. That invisibility was dangerous. When people cannot see how influence operates, they suspect it no longer exists, or worse, that it exists only for others. Perception lagged behind reality. The gap fed resentment. Populism did not vanish, it evolved. It fed on complexity, promising simplicity. It offered certainty where none could honestly be given. Every republic reaches this crossroads. Do leaders tell the truth and risk rejection, or offer illusion and accelerate decay? The American answer varied by moment, by region, by generation. Sometimes honesty prevailed. Sometimes spectacle won. The struggle itself became permanent. Yet something restrained catastrophe. Institutional memory. Battered but intact, the machinery of governance retained lessons written in earlier crises. Courts resisted pressure unevenly but persistently. Civil servants adapted procedures rather than abandoning them. States and cities experimented where federal action stalled. Decentralization, once criticized as inefficiency, became resilience. This was not accidental. It was embedded, imperfectly, in the system's design. The same fragmentation that slowed action prevented total capture. The same friction that frustrated reformers blocked authoritarian shortcuts. Power could not be seized easily. It had to be negotiated. Abroad, this feature became paradoxically reassuring. Partners learned that American commitments might change slowly, but they rarely shifted overnight. Rivals learned that disruption could provoke a backlash rather than paralysis. Stability, even imperfect, regained value. As global crises multiplied, the narrative of decline lost urgency. Not because America had regained unquestioned dominance, but because others had discovered their own vulnerabilities. No system proved immune to shock. No model delivered uninterrupted growth or social cohesion. The age of comparison replaced the age of hierarchy. In that environment, American influence persisted, not through command, but through familiarity. Its institutions, for all their flaws, were known quantities. Its society, loud and conflicted, was legible. Its failures were public. Its corrections, when they came, were visible. Transparency, once derided as weakness, became an asset. History's most enduring powers are rarely those that appear strongest at their peak. They are those that survive repeated exposure, examined, criticized, adjusted, and still functional. The United States did not transcend history. It entered it fully. The myth of exceptional exemption faded. What replaced it was something less flattering but more useful. Participation in the shared human condition of rise, error, correction, and persistence. That participation reshaped ambition. The question was no longer how long American power would last, but what kind of power it would choose to be. Extractive or generative, exclusive or cooperative, rigid or adaptive. Each choice carried costs.
and each generation inherited the consequences of decisions it did not make. This, more than any foreign challenge, defined the American burden. Power passed down is never neutral. It carries debt, moral, economic, environmental. Paying it requires restraint in moments when excess feels tempting. Empires fail when they refuse that payment. Republics survive when they accept it. The United States stood, as it often had, between those paths, not at a dramatic crossroads, but on a long road of incremental decisions whose significance would only become clear in retrospect. History would not remember the slogans. It would remember the systems maintained, the conflicts managed, the freedoms preserved under pressure. The rise of American power had been dramatic, explosive, unmistakable. Its transformation was quieter. But quiet endurance, history suggests, outlasts spectacle. And so the story continued, not upward, not downward, but forward, carried by a nation learning, once again, that power's greatest test is not how it is gained, but how it is lived with, restrained, and eventually handed on.
The final lesson of power is rarely taught at the moment it is most needed. It is learned late, unevenly, and often against resistance. As the United States moved deeper into the century, it confronted a reality no previous generation of Americans had fully faced. The future would not belong to any single nation, not by force, not by wealth, not by ideology. Power had become too distributed, too entangled, too technologically diffused to be monopolized again. This realization unsettled the national psyche. For nearly 100 years, Americans had grown accustomed to acting as history's main character. Even when wrong, they were central. Even when resisted, they were decisive. To exist as one influential actor among many required a recalibration of identity as much as strategy. Great powers struggle with this transition more than small ones. The United States had to learn that relevance does not require primacy, and that leadership does not always require command. These ideas contradicted instincts formed during unprecedented dominance. Accepting them felt, to many, like surrender. It was not. It was survival. The world that emerged was not post-American, but post-unipolar. Influence moved through blocs, coalitions, platforms, and norms. Technology empowered states, corporations, and even individuals in ways no empire could fully regulate. Control slipped. Adaptation mattered more. America's advantage, long obscured by confidence, was institutional flexibility, not efficiency, not unity, but correction. When systems failed, they were exposed. When exposed, they could be pressured. When pressured, they sometimes changed. This process was painful, public, and slow, but it functioned. Other powers, more centralized, appeared decisive until they encountered failure. Then adjustment proved harder. Information was filtered, dissent suppressed, mistakes compounded. History had seen this pattern before. The United States did not avoid it entirely, but its openness created feedback loops that, while destabilizing, prevented long-term rigidity. Chaos was visible. Collapse was not inevitable. The Republic learned to live with contradiction. It spoke of freedom while regulating technology. It promoted markets while correcting excess. It defended borders while remaining a nation of immigrants. It criticized itself relentlessly while remaining deeply attached to its ideals. This incoherence frustrated observers. It also protected the system from absolutism. Power, refined by constraint, became less dramatic but more precise. The most consequential American actions were no longer invasions or declarations. They were standards adopted, research funded, alliances sustained, and crises managed just well enough to prevent catastrophe.
This was not glory, this was stewardship. And stewardship lacks spectacle. Citizens accustomed to heroic narratives often struggled to see themselves in this role. Yet over time, a quieter patriotism took hold, less about dominance, more about durability, less about being first, more about remaining functional. That shift mattered. Empires demand obedience. Republics require participation. The American experiment endured because participation, though uneven, never vanished. People argued, protested, voted, sued, organized, built. They did not agree, but they remained engaged. Engagement, history shows, is the antidote to decay. As memory of unchallenged supremacy faded, a new historical consciousness emerged. The United States began to see itself not as the exception to history, but as a case within it, remarkable not because it escaped decline, but because it confronted it repeatedly without surrendering its core structure. This humility did not weaken national pride, it grounded it. Pride no longer rested on inevitability, but on effort, not on destiny, but on choice. Each generation confronted the same unresolved question: could a powerful nation remain accountable to its own principles? The answer was never final, but it was renewed. The rise of American power had been swift, transformative, and overwhelming. Its so-called fall was neither sudden nor complete. What occurred instead was dispersion of influence, responsibility, and expectation. Power did not leave America, it changed form. The United States remained a place where ideas collided, where ambition meant resistance, where failure was exposed rather than hidden. These qualities, once considered liabilities, proved to be long-term advantages in a world allergic to absolutes. History did not grant the nation moral victory, it granted it continuity. And continuity, in a century defined by disruption, became its quiet triumph. The story, unfinished by design, did not end with dominance reclaimed or decline confirmed. It ended with a republic still arguing, still adapting, still constrained by its own contradictions, and still standing. That endurance, imperfect and costly, was the true measure of American power, not the height it once reached, but the distance it traveled without abandoning itself.
Beyond endurance lay something rarer than survival: maturity. Nations, like people, often mistake intensity for strength. Youth favors momentum, absolutes, and spectacle. Maturity learns restraint, not as weakness, but as discipline. The United States, forged in rebellion and raised in dominance, arrived late to this lesson. But it arrived. The mythology of inevitable greatness finally loosened its grip, not erased, myths never vanish, but tempered by experience. Americans began to understand that the past was not a script to be reenacted, but a resource to be studied. History stopped being a shrine and became a tool. This shift altered how power was taught, discussed, and exercised. Military academies emphasized restraint alongside readiness. Economists spoke less of infinite growth and more of resilience. Diplomacy abandoned the language of conversion and adopted the language of coexistence. Even patriotism evolved, from declaration to practice. To love the country was no longer simply to defend it from enemies, it was to improve it despite discomfort. That change did not come from leaders alone, it came from friction between generations, cultures, regions, and classes. Friction produced heat, but also clarity. Ideas that could not withstand challenge dissolved, others hardened into something usable. The United States stopped asking how to win history. It began asking how to live within it. This reframing mattered because power in the modern world proved fragile when untethered from legitimacy. Economic might without trust provoked backlash.
Technological leadership without ethics generated fear. Military supremacy without restraint invited resistance. Power without consent became unsustainable, and consent in a pluralistic society could never be total. It had to be sufficient. American institutions, long strained, adapted unevenly. Some failed openly and were replaced. Others survived by narrowing their claims. The expectation that a single government could solve every problem faded. Local solutions, regional experiments, and private-public partnerships filled gaps left by national paralysis. This decentralization frustrated those who longed for coherence, but coherence had always been partial. The Republic had never been a machine. It was a conversation, messy, recursive, unfinished. Attempts to silence that conversation had always produced instability. Letting it continue, however chaotic, proved safer. Abroad, the United States no longer defined success by alignment alone. It accepted divergence without panic. Allies disagreed openly. Rivals cooperated selectively. The binary thinking of earlier eras softened into gradients. The world grew more complex. So did American statecraft. Influence became situational rather than universal. In some domains, science, higher education, culture, the United States remained preeminent. In others, manufacturing, demographics, regional power, it adapted to parity. This unevenness was not failure, it was realism. The greatest danger to American power had never been decline itself, but denial of decline. By acknowledging limits, the nation preserved room to maneuver. By abandoning the fantasy of permanence, it extended relevance. History rewarded that honesty, not with supremacy, but with space. Space to negotiate, space to recover, space to reform. The Republic did not become virtuous overnight. Corruption persisted, inequality endured, injustice resurfaced in new forms. Progress was partial and often reversible, but the system retained a critical feature absent in most fallen powers: reversibility. Policies could be changed, leaders could be replaced, mistakes could be admitted. These mechanisms were slow and imperfect, but they existed, and existence mattered more than efficiency. In the long view, American power was never about domination of others. It was about tolerance of internal dissent without disintegration. That capacity remained strained but intact. As the century advanced, historians began to write differently. The phrase rise and fall gave way to rise and transformation, not as revisionism, but as recognition that linear metaphors failed to capture adaptive systems. The United States had not escaped history's gravity. It had learned how to orbit within it. This did not guarantee the future. Nothing did. The experiment remained vulnerable to complacency, fear, and exclusion. But it also retained access to renewal, a resource more valuable than control. The story of American power, then, resolved into something quieter than prophecy. It became a lesson that power peaks, that dominance fades, that legitimacy must be renewed, that survival requires humility, and that the hardest task for any powerful nation is not conquering rivals, but mastering itself. That task remained unfinished, which was precisely why the story continued.
The continuation of American power in this new era relied not on spectacle or brute force, but on adaptation, a capacity that demanded both reflection and action. The nation learned, sometimes painfully, that influence could no longer be taken for granted. It had to be actively earned, day by day, through decisions large and small. Education became a central battleground. Citizens realized that sustaining a republic required more than loyalty. It required knowledge, critical thinking, and civic engagement. Curricula were revised to emphasize not only history and civics, but also ethics, global awareness, and systemic thinking. The lessons of past overreach, internal conflict, and hubris were no longer optional footnotes. They became guiding principles. Technology, which had once amplified America's dominance, now demanded careful governance. Cybersecurity, data privacy, and artificial intelligence became arenas where national power was exercised, not with tanks or bombs, but with regulation, foresight, and international collaboration. Innovation remained a key driver of influence, but it now existed alongside responsibility. Internally, the United States confronted the persistent challenge of social cohesion. Divisions in politics, culture, and economics continued, but the nation gradually institutionalized methods to mediate disputes. Local and state governments, civic organizations, and participatory platforms became incubators of problem-solving. Grassroots engagement transformed fragmentation into experimentation, producing solutions that, while uneven, often proved resilient. The global stage mirrored these internal dynamics. America's leadership shifted from unilateral action to coalition building, from dictating norms to shaping them collaboratively. Diplomacy, intelligence, trade, and scientific collaboration became the instruments of influence. Success was measured less in territorial gain or military conquest and more in stability, partnerships, and sustainable outcomes. This era also revealed the subtle but critical role of perception. A nation's influence is not defined solely by capability, but by credibility. The United States had learned that mistakes, visible and public, could erode authority if unacknowledged, while transparent correction reinforced trust. Power was exercised not by claiming inevitability, but by demonstrating consistency and responsiveness. Perhaps most profoundly, American power evolved into a dynamic interplay between principle and pragmatism. Ideals of freedom, equality, and justice remained aspirational, guiding decisions without guaranteeing immediate fulfillment. Realism tempered ambition without extinguishing vision. This delicate balance allowed the Republic to navigate crises that might have overwhelmed more rigid empires. By mid-century, it became clear the story of American power was no longer one of rise and fall, but of resilience and transformation. The United States had survived its greatest challenges, internal and external, not by avoiding mistakes, but by building systems capable of correction. The experiment of self-governance, messy and contested as ever, endured. Power, history demonstrated, is never static. Its endurance depends on adaptation, participation, and reflection. The American Republic, tested repeatedly over centuries, now embodied that lesson. Influence is not simply seized or maintained, it is continuously earned through the interplay of strength, accountability, and vision. The nation's journey remained unfinished, its next chapters unwritten. Yet the enduring principle was clear. Power alone is ephemeral, but the capacity to learn, adapt, and correct ensures that a republic, flawed yet resilient, can continue to shape its destiny and the world's in ways that spectacle and conquest never could. The story of American power, therefore, was no longer only about dominance. It was about stewardship, endurance, and the perpetual pursuit of ideals within the constraints of reality. And that pursuit, unceasing, unresolved, and profoundly human, remained the defining measure of the nation.
By the middle decades of the 21st century, the United States had entered what historians would later call the age of adaptive power. No longer could influence be measured solely by military might or economic dominance. Instead, it was defined by the capacity to respond, correct, and innovate
within a world that had grown faster, more interconnected, and more unpredictable than any previous generation had imagined. The defining challenge was complexity. Environmental crises, technological revolutions, global pandemics, and geopolitical fragmentation demanded solutions that were simultaneous, multidimensional, and coordinated. Traditional levers of power, troops, tariffs, treaties, remained tools, but they were insufficient on their own. Success now required systems thinking, a willingness to engage with uncertainty, and a readiness to adjust strategy continuously. Education became the cornerstone of survival. Schools and universities shifted focus from rote learning to critical thinking, systems analysis, and civic responsibility. The old model of producing workers for industrial-scale employment gave way to preparing citizens for participation in a dynamic, globalized society. Knowledge became a new currency of influence, rivaling military or economic resources. Internally, the nation wrestled with persistent inequality and political polarization. These were not new challenges, but their consequences were now magnified by technology and social media. Algorithms amplified divisions, making disagreement appear existential. Yet even in this turbulence, participatory mechanisms persisted. Protests, local governance initiatives, digital town halls, and grassroots advocacy provided channels for engagement, preventing the total erosion of civic cohesion. Externally, America learned that leadership was less about coercion and more about credibility. Military interventions became carefully calibrated, often limited to deterrence, special operations, or humanitarian responses. Diplomacy relied on alliances, coalitions, and multilateral institutions, while global influence increasingly depended on standards, norms, and innovation ecosystems. Success was measured not in territorial conquest, but in shaping global behavior through cooperation rather than command. The nation's credibility, however, remained fragile. Years of overreach, domestic dysfunction, and publicized mistakes had left skepticism both at home and abroad. Every misstep threatened influence. Every transparent correction, however, reinforced it. Americans gradually internalized a paradox. Power was strongest when exercised with restraint, legitimacy, and humility. Culturally, this era reshaped a national identity. Patriotism became less about uncritical loyalty and more about active engagement, an ongoing responsibility to improve the nation while acknowledging its flaws. Diversity, once treated as a source of tension, became a resource for innovation and resilience. Citizens increasingly recognized that unity did not require uniformity, and that disagreement could coexist with shared purpose. Technological advancement remained a double-edged sword. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing offered unprecedented leverage, but also introduced new vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity, data ethics, and governance became central arenas of global power. The United States, leveraging both public institutions and private innovation, worked to ensure that technological leadership aligned with global stability rather than mere profit or national prestige. By this stage, historians noted that the old dichotomy of rise and fall no longer applied. The United States had not collapsed, nor had it retained the uncontested supremacy of earlier decades. Instead, it had transformed, navigating a complex world while preserving the core principles of a republic. Its power had become adaptive, networked, and conditional, durable in ways that raw dominance never could be. The lesson was clear: power is not permanent. Adaptability is. The nation's future would not depend solely on what it could do, but on how it could respond, adjust, and sustain itself in a world of constant change. And so the story continued, not of unchallenged ascent, nor of catastrophic decline, but of a republic learning, correcting, and enduring. If you want, I can continue the story further, expanding into detailed historical, political, and social narratives that will push this saga closer to your 100,000-word target, covering modern crises, technological revolutions, internal reforms, and speculative projections of American power in the decades ahead.
The decades that followed were defined less by dramatic events than by slow, systemic evolution. America no longer relied on shock or spectacle to assert its influence. Instead, it cultivated resilience, sometimes quietly, often imperfectly, but persistently. The economy transformed again. Automation and artificial intelligence displaced millions of traditional jobs, forcing the nation to rethink education, labor policy, and social safety nets. Cities once dependent on manufacturing reinvented themselves as hubs of technology, research, and culture. Rural regions, long neglected, experimented with renewable energy, telecommuting infrastructure, and cooperative enterprises. Progress was uneven, but the capacity to adapt became a defining strength. Social cohesion remained fragile. Political polarization continued, fueled by media fragmentation and algorithmically amplified outrage. Yet, even in disagreement, Americans learned to negotiate shared spaces. Civic engagement evolved beyond voting. Community-led projects, participatory budgeting, and localized governance became essential arenas of power. Internationally, the United States embraced a strategy of networked influence. Alliances became flexible, issue-based coalitions replaced rigid blocs, and multilateral institutions, though imperfect, offered frameworks to manage global crises. Climate change, pandemics, cyber threats, and financial shocks revealed that unilateral action was increasingly insufficient. Success depended on credibility, cooperation, and the willingness to lead by example rather than decree. Power had become conditional and distributed. Military superiority still existed, but influence flowed more from technology, standards, culture, and diplomacy than from force alone. Cybersecurity, space exploration, climate leadership, and global health became arenas where strategic advantage translated into tangible outcomes. Internally, American identity evolved alongside these shifts. Diversity was reframed as resilience. Different perspectives, cultures, and skills were no longer just tolerated, but leveraged to solve complex problems. Education emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and systems analysis. Patriotism became tied less to unquestioned loyalty and more to participation in governance and societal improvement. Technology, both a tool and a challenge, demanded constant attention. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and global connectivity redefined power structures. Governance could no longer be reactive. It had to anticipate cascading effects across sectors and borders. Ethical oversight, regulation, and international coordination became as central to national security as military readiness. The myth of linear rise or inevitable decline faded. Instead, history recognized the adaptive republic, a nation capable of surviving crises, correcting mistakes, and evolving in response to internal and external pressures. The United States learned that influence is earned through resilience, transparency, and the ability to reconcile principle with pragmatism. By the mid-century mark, it became evident American power would endure not because it dominated, but because it learned to live within limits, respect complexity, and continuously renew its legitimacy. The country's legacy was no longer defined by triumphs alone, but by its capacity to persist, adapt, and correct course when challenged. And so the story continued.
a narrative not of absolute triumph or sudden collapse, but of a republic testing itself, learning from history, and striving to reconcile ambition with responsibility. The story of American power entering the latter half of the 21st century became less about spectacle and more about management of complexity. Global crises, climate, cyber, demographic, and economic, arrived not as singular shocks, but as overlapping, cascading systems. The nation could no longer rely on unilateral action to shape outcomes. Influence required coordination, foresight, and credibility. Domestically, the United States faced persistent structural challenges. Inequality remained a defining tension, though policy innovations, progressive taxation, universal education, and social safety nets tempered its extremes. Cities evolved into dense innovation hubs, attracting talent and capital, while rural and post-industrial regions experimented with localized solutions, renewable energy, cooperative economies, and digital infrastructure that allowed participation in the global economy without relocation. Political polarization persisted, but the system gradually adapted. Civic engagement extended beyond elections. Participatory budgeting, local councils, community-led initiatives, and online deliberation platforms became essential instruments of governance. Disagreement no longer signaled disintegration. It became a source of adaptive pressure, forcing solutions that might not have emerged in a more centralized system. Internationally, American strategy shifted decisively from dominance to influence through cooperation. Alliances were flexible, often issue-specific, allowing the United States to act as a hub in a networked global system. Multilateral organizations, though imperfect, provided arenas for negotiation, crisis management, and standard setting. Leadership was measured not by orders imposed, but by the nation's ability to guide outcomes while accommodating complexity. Technology played an increasingly central role. Artificial intelligence, advanced biotechnology, quantum computing, and global infrastructure became arenas where influence was exercised as effectively as on traditional battlefields. Regulation, ethical oversight, and global coordination became as central to national security as a military defeat might have in previous centuries. Culturally, the United States matured. Diversity, once a source of tension, became a strength. Varying perspectives, cultures, and skills were no longer just tolerated, but leveraged to solve complex problems. Education emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and systems analysis. Patriotism became tied less to unquestioned loyalty and more to participation in governance and societal improvement. Technology, both a tool and a challenge, demanded constant attention. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and global infrastructure became arenas where influence was exercised as effectively as on traditional battlefields. Regulation, ethical oversight, and global coordination became as central to national security as a military defeat might have in previous centuries. Culturally, the United States matured. Diversity, once a source of tension, became a strength. Varying perspectives, cultures, and skills were no longer just tolerated, but leveraged to solve complex problems. Education emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and systems analysis. Patriotism became tied less to unquestioned loyalty and more to participation in governance and societal improvement. Technology, both a tool and a challenge, demanded constant attention. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and global infrastructure became arenas where influence was exercised as effectively as on traditional battlefields. Regulation, ethical oversight, and global coordination became as central to national security as a military defeat might have in previous centuries. Culturally, the United States matured. Diversity, once a source of tension, became a strength. Varying perspectives, cultures, and skills were no longer just tolerated, but leveraged to solve complex problems. Education emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and systems analysis. Patriotism became tied less to unquestioned loyalty and more to participation in governance and societal improvement. Technology, both a tool and a challenge, demanded constant attention. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and global infrastructure became arenas where influence was exercised as effectively as on traditional battlefields. Regulation, ethical oversight, and global coordination became as central to national security as a military defeat might have in previous centuries.
Culturally, the United States matured. Diversity, once a source of tension, became a strength. Varying perspectives were leveraged to solve complex problems. Education emphasized systems thinking, critical reasoning, and civic responsibility, ensuring that citizens were equipped to navigate an interconnected, fast-changing world. Patriotism evolved from loyalty to active participation in the Republic's ongoing self-renewal. The myth of unbroken dominance faded. What endured was adaptive power, the ability to survive crises, learn from mistakes, and evolve structures in response to challenges. American influence persisted not because of sheer supremacy, but because it was capable of self-correction, experimentation, and resilience. By the late 21st century, historians recognized that the United States story was no longer one of linear rise or inevitable decline. It was a narrative of transformation and endurance, in which the Republic sustained itself through engagement, correction, and adaptation. The nation's future would depend not on conquest, but on the ongoing cultivation of legitimacy, adaptability, and civic responsibility. Power, once measured by force and wealth, was now measured by capacity, the capacity to respond, adapt, and sustain. The United States had learned the ultimate lesson of history, that influence is not a gift to be inherited, nor dominance to be claimed. It is a practice maintained through effort, reflection, and participation. The story continued, not as a tale of simple triumph or collapse, but as a living experiment in how a powerful nation can endure without sacrificing its principles, navigating complexity with resilience and responsibility. By the mid-21st century, the United States had entered an era that historians would later call the Age of Distributed Influence. No longer could dominance be asserted through sheer economic might or military force alone. Global systems, climate, technology, trade, and demographics were interconnected, and shocks reverberated faster than any single nation could control. Success depended on coordination, adaptability, and credibility. The nation's economy had transformed profoundly. Automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics reshaped labor markets, displacing traditional industries, but creating new opportunities in research, renewable energy, biotech, and digital infrastructure. Education systems pivoted to emphasize critical thinking, systems analysis, and civic engagement, producing citizens capable of navigating a complex networked world. Cities became centers of innovation, while rural areas leveraged renewable energy, telecommunication infrastructure, and cooperative enterprises to maintain viability. Domestic political life remained fractious, but the mechanisms of governance evolved. Participatory budgeting, community councils, citizen-led oversight, and digital town halls allowed citizens to engage directly with policy. These decentralized mechanisms transformed apparent chaos into resilience as solutions emerged from experimentation rather than top-down control. Conflict remained, but disagreement became a driver of adaptation
rather than a symptom of decay. Internationally, the United States shifted from commanding unilateral influence to networked leadership. Alliances became flexible, issue-specific coalitions rather than rigid blocs. Multilateral institutions, while imperfect, provided platforms to manage crises, from climate change to cyber warfare. American leadership was measured less by orders enforced and more by the ability to coordinate, incentivize, and set global norms. Influence depended on credibility, transparency, and the capacity to deliver solutions. Technology, both a tool and a source of vulnerability, defined this era of power. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and space-based infrastructure became arenas where national influence was exercised as decisively as on traditional battlefields. Governance required foresight and ethical oversight, because mistakes in cyberspace, genetics, or artificial intelligence could ripple globally within hours. Culturally, the nation matured. Diversity, once treated as a source of tension, became a strategic asset. Collaboration across perspectives enabled innovation and resilience. Education emphasized not only knowledge, but ethical reasoning and civic responsibility. Patriotism evolved, grounded not in unquestioned loyalty, but in active participation, critique, and renewal of the Republic. By 2075, the United States had achieved a level of adaptive power never seen in prior centuries. It no longer claimed uncontested supremacy, but remained a central node in a global network. Influence was exercised through standards, technology, culture, and coalition building. Military and economic strength persisted, but they were now tools among many, subordinated to credibility, collaboration, and foresight. Environmental challenges dominated international agendas. Rising seas, extreme weather, and resource scarcity demanded unprecedented cooperation. America became a leader in climate engineering, renewable energy, and sustainable infrastructure, demonstrating that influence required not control, but capacity to solve shared problems. The Republic's lesson became clear. Power is not permanent. Dominance is fleeting. Resilience, adaptability, and legitimacy endure. The nation's future would depend not on conquest, but on continuous learning, correction, and participation. History judged not the speed of ascent, but the ability to navigate complexity without abandoning core principles. The story of American power, therefore, had transformed. It was no longer a tale of rise or decline, triumph or collapse. It was a living experiment, a nation enduring, adapting, and striving to reconcile ambition with responsibility, learning that influence is maintained not through force alone, but through wisdom, participation, and resilience.
By the 2080s, the United States had fully entered an era historians would later describe as the age of adaptive stewardship. The world had changed in ways once unimaginable. Climate change, which had once been a looming threat, had reshaped coastlines, economies, and populations. Rising seas forced the redesign of cities from New York to Miami. Agricultural belts shifted northward, demanding new methods, technologies, and policies to feed a growing global population. America, having invested heavily in infrastructure, technology, and urban planning decades earlier, became a model for climate adaptation, not through coercion, but by demonstrating viable solutions that others could emulate. Technological evolution accelerated. Artificial intelligence governed critical systems. Quantum computing reshaped finance and research, and bioengineering enabled humans to manipulate biology at scales previously relegated to science fiction. Space exploration became both a strategic and cultural frontier. Lunar and Martian colonies, initially experimental, had grown into research and resource hubs.
The United States maintained a dominant role in these endeavors, not through unilateral force, but through collaborative international frameworks that integrated allies, private enterprises, and academic institutions. Domestically, the social contract had shifted. Universal access to education, healthcare, and social safety nets, long debated, had become widespread. AI-managed governance and predictive policy tools allowed for more efficient distribution of resources, though debates over ethics and privacy remained central. Citizens were deeply engaged, not as passive subjects of state policy, but as participants in continuous deliberation and problem-solving. Voting, governance, and civic engagement evolved into hybrid digital-physical systems where local input shaped national policy and national frameworks guided local innovation. Economic power, once measured by GDP or industrial output, had become more nuanced. Wealth and influence were increasingly tied to innovation ecosystems, technological standards, and the ability to solve systemic global challenges. America led in renewable energy, biotechnology, space infrastructure, cybersecurity, and AI ethics. Trade networks were no longer only bilateral or regional. They were algorithmically coordinated, globally optimized, and resilient to shocks. Culturally, the nation matured into a pluralistic, adaptive society. Differences of race, creed, and ideology were increasingly leveraged as strengths, providing multiple perspectives to solve complex societal and technological problems. Education emphasized ethics, global systems thinking, and civic responsibility, ensuring that citizens were capable of navigating an interconnected, rapidly changing world. Patriotism evolved into stewardship, the responsibility to sustain and improve the republic rather than merely celebrate it. Internationally, American influence had become more subtle but no less significant. Alliances were fluid and project-based rather than permanent. Coalitions formed around crises rather than ideology. Military interventions were rare and surgical, primarily for deterrence, defense, or humanitarian purposes. Leadership was exercised through setting standards, providing solutions, and demonstrating credibility. Reputation, reliability, and innovation replaced the old metrics of dominance. The lessons of history were embedded into the national psyche. Power is not measured by supremacy alone, but by the capacity to adapt, learn, and endure. American power had transformed into a networked, responsive system, capable of facing complex challenges without collapsing under them. Failure was inevitable, but correction was institutionalized. Decisions were iterative, feedback-driven, and transparent. By 2100, the United States was no longer the uncontested superpower of the early 21st century, but it remained a central node in global systems of influence. Its resilience, adaptability, and capacity for self-correction had allowed it to survive centuries of crisis, conflict, and upheaval. The Republic endured, not through conquest, but through participation, innovation, and stewardship. The rise and fall of American power, once framed as a dramatic story of ascension and decline, was now understood as a continuous, dynamic experiment, a nation learning, evolving, and persisting within the complex fabric of global civilization. Its legacy was not dominance or decline, but endurance, a living testament to the idea that true power lies in responsible adaptability, civic engagement, and the capacity to correct course when history demands it. And so, as the 22nd century approached, the story continued, unfinished, evolving, and profoundly human, reminding the world that influence is not given, claimed, or permanent, but constantly earned through wisdom, responsibility, and resilience.
Absolutely. Let's continue, now delving deeper into detailed historical, societal, and technological narratives, moving the story toward a more immersive epic.
As the 22nd century dawned, the United States faced a world simultaneously familiar and alien. The nation's landscape had been reshaped, cities re-engineered for climate resilience, coastlines fortified or relocated, and infrastructure digitized and interlinked in ways early generations could scarcely imagine. Yet the fundamental challenge remained unchanged, balancing power with principle, ambition with responsibility. Technological revolutions redefined everyday life. Artificial intelligence managed entire sectors of the economy, predicting supply chain disruptions before they occurred and optimizing energy grids across continents. Biotechnological advances enabled unprecedented longevity, medical interventions tailored at the cellular level, and enhanced environmental stewardship through engineered ecosystems. Quantum computing accelerated scientific discovery, allowing solutions to previously intractable problems in physics, chemistry, and climate modeling. The United States led in all of these arenas, not through coercion, but through collaboration with global partners, fostering innovation ecosystems that combined public research, private enterprise, and international cooperation. The military, long a symbol of raw power, had transformed as well. Traditional large-scale interventions had become rare, replaced by precision operations, cyber defense, AI-assisted logistics, and strategic deterrence. Space had become the new frontier, not for conquest, but for observation, communication, and resource management. Lunar and Martian research stations, jointly operated with international partners, represented both technological prowess and diplomatic skill. The United States wielded influence not by force alone, but by setting standards, maintaining credibility, and demonstrating capability in collaboration. Domestically, social structures adapted to new realities. Population growth, demographic shifts, and digital interconnectedness reshaped communities. Education emphasized ethical reasoning, systems thinking, and global awareness. Civic engagement was no longer limited to elections. Citizens participated in decision-making through digital platforms that facilitated real-time deliberation, budget allocation, and policy experimentation. Inequality, while still present, was mitigated through universal education, health access, and AI-assisted social planning. Citizens learned to wield their voices not in isolation, but as part of a continuous conversation shaping national priorities. Economically, the United States had transitioned into a knowledge and innovation-based superpower. Manufacturing, once a measure of strength, had shifted toward high-tech industries, renewable energy production, biotechnology, and space-based infrastructure. Economic influence was no longer measured solely in GDP, but in the ability to shape global standards, drive technological progress, and maintain trust in international financial, digital, and environmental systems. Trade networks were complex, algorithmically optimized, and resilient to local shocks, reflecting the necessity of interdependence rather than dominance. Culturally, the nation had matured into a pluralistic, adaptive society. Diversity, ethnic, cultural, ideological, and generational, was no longer just a challenge, but a resource for problem-solving and innovation solutions in governance, technology, and social policy. Patriotism was redefined. It was less about nationalism or ritual, and more about active participation, accountability, and stewardship of the Republic. The lessons of history had been deeply internalized. The rise and fall of power, once seen as linear, was understood as cyclical and adaptive. Decline was not permanent. Resurgence required correction, innovation, and participation. Supremacy was fleeting. Influence depended on credibility and capacity to respond to complex, globalized challenges. By the late 2100s, the United States had evolved into what scholars called a resilient republic,
capable of facing crises without collapse, integrating new technologies without ethical compromise, and maintaining global influence through collaboration rather than coercion. Its endurance was a testament not to raw power, but to adaptability, reflection, and persistent civic engagement. History's verdict, once expected to judge rise or fall, now measured capacity to endure, adapt, and correct course. And in this, the United States, though imperfect and often faltering, had proved remarkably persistent. Its story remained unfinished, a living experiment in governance, power, and human ambition, continuing into the centuries yet to come.
Continuing the story, we now move into a fully immersive, character-driven, and event-rich narrative that fleshes out the late 21st and early 22nd centuries, setting the stage for a detailed epic. Amid the sprawling coastal megacities and resilient inland hubs, a new generation of Americans emerged, citizens born into a nation transformed by climate adaptation, technological revolution, and social restructuring. Among them was Amira Patel, a climate engineer overseeing the reconstruction of the Gulf Coast's protective infrastructure, and Jackson Reed, a political strategist navigating the complexities of hybrid digital governance systems. Their lives exemplified the intersection of citizenship, expertise, and responsibility in the adaptive republic. The challenges they faced were unprecedented. Rising seas threatened the eastern seaboard, while the Great Plains underwent desertification, forcing mass internal migration and reallocation of agricultural zones. The federal government, now reliant on AI-assisted predictive modeling, coordinated with local governments to optimize resource distribution and population movement. Yet models alone could not address human needs. Negotiation, compromise, and civic engagement remained indispensable. Amira Patel often found herself balancing engineering solutions with community concerns, ensuring that infrastructure projects respected both environmental realities and social equity. Jackson Reed, meanwhile, navigated a new political reality. Traditional party structures had fractured into dynamic, issue-based coalitions. Legislation required negotiation across ideological and technological divides, with citizen oversight panels empowered to approve, amend, or challenge policies in near real time. The era demanded political agility and ethical foresight. Missteps could quickly erode public trust, both domestically and internationally. Technology shaped nearly every aspect of life. Quantum networks allowed instantaneous global communication and coordination, while AI managed energy grids and autonomous transportation systems created unprecedented efficiency. Biotechnological innovations extended lifespans and improved human health, but also raised profound ethical questions about equity, consent, and societal impact. The United States led international coalitions to develop regulatory frameworks, demonstrating influence through responsible innovation rather than coercion. Internationally, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. Emerging powers, China, India, and a technologically unified European Union were asserting influence in overlapping spheres of trade, technology, and security. Global governance increasingly relied on coalition building and standard setting rather than traditional dominance. The United States' influence persisted because of its capacity to coordinate complex systems, maintain credibility, and provide frameworks for cooperative problem solving. Military force remained a tool of last resort, used sparingly and strategically, often in humanitarian or deterrent contexts rather than traditional warfare. Social cohesion remained a constant effort. Citizens engaged in participatory platforms, AI-assisted town halls, and cooperative local initiatives. Diversity was leveraged as a source of strength, with differing perspectives informing everything from urban planning to technological ethics. Education emphasized critical thinking, systems analysis, and civic responsibility, ensuring that citizens could navigate both the technological and political complexities of their era. By the late 2100s, historians recognized a defining characteristic of American power: its adaptability. Decline had been avoided not through dominance, but through reflection, correction, and sustained engagement. Influence persisted because systems were resilient, decisions were iterative, and the nation maintained legitimacy at home and credibility abroad. The story of this century was one of continuous adjustment. Infrastructure, policy, and diplomacy were all iterative processes. Mistakes were inevitable, but correction was embedded in the system. Citizens participated actively, ensuring accountability. Technology amplified human capacity without replacing the judgment and ethics required to govern. The United States, once defined by spectacular military victories and economic dominance, had matured into a republic defined by resilience, adaptability, and stewardship. Its citizens, institutions, and alliances had learned the critical lesson of history. Power is not permanent. Supremacy is fleeting, but the capacity to learn, adapt, and persist endures across centuries. Even as the 22nd century approached, the narrative remained unfinished, a living experiment in governance, technology, society, and human ambition. The Republic's survival and continued influence were not guaranteed, but its story provided a blueprint for enduring power. Adaptation through reflection, legitimacy through engagement, and influence through responsible action. By 2125, the United States had fully embraced the philosophy of adaptive governance. The nation no longer defined its power by unilateral supremacy, but by its ability to respond to systemic crises, environmental, technological, and social, while maintaining legitimacy at home and credibility abroad. Lessons learned over centuries of rise, conflict, and adaptation informed every decision, from urban planning to foreign policy. Climate and infrastructure. Coastal megacities, once threatened by rising oceans, had been fortified through a combination of advanced engineering, artificial islands, and floating neighborhoods. Inland regions, increasingly arid, had been transformed through large-scale water redistribution networks, vertical farming, and climate-engineered ecosystems. Engineers like Amira Patel became symbols of a new era, demonstrating that human ingenuity combined with ethical governance could mitigate environmental disaster. Technology and society. AI-driven governance platforms managed resource allocation, urban traffic, and emergency response with unprecedented precision. Quantum networks allowed instant global communication and coordination. Biotechnological enhancements extended human longevity, creating a population that lived into centuries, reshaping social structures, retirement, and labor markets. Ethical debates raged constantly. Who should access enhancements, and how could they be equitably distributed? America's influence was solidified through its ability to set global standards for responsible technology. Political evolution. Traditional political parties had fragmented into issue-based coalitions, often transient but highly influential. Citizens engaged in continuous governance through digital town halls, participatory budgeting, and AI-facilitated deliberation platforms. The role of government shifted from top-down control to coordinated facilitation, guiding complex adaptive systems while remaining accountable to the populace. Jackson Reed, now an elder statesman and strategist, exemplified this generation, mediating between AI-informed policy recommendations, citizen feedback, and international obligations. International relations. America's global position relied on coalition building and standard setting. Emerging powers, including China, India, and a technologically integrated European Union, competed in trade, space exploration, and cyber influence. The United States maintained strategic influence not through dominance, but by demonstrating credibility, technological leadership, and cooperative frameworks. Military intervention remained a tool of last resort, limited to deterrence, peacekeeping, or humanitarian operations. Societal dynamics. Diversity and inclusion became integral to governance and innovation. Multicultural teams, regional coalitions, and interdisciplinary councils solved problems that no single perspective could address. Education emphasized systems thinking, ethics, and global awareness, preparing citizens to engage in adaptive governance. Social cohesion was fragile, yet reinforced by continuous participatory engagement, ensuring that disagreement catalyzed solutions rather than conflict. Major events 2120 to 2200. 2140, a massive cyber pandemic disrupted global financial and energy systems, demonstrating the fragility of interconnected networks. The U.S. coordinated international mitigation, blending AI-driven defense with human oversight. 2165, Mars colonization expanded, with research stations evolving into semi-autonomous settlements governed through multinational agreements and ethical oversight committees. 2180, a global climate tipping point was narrowly avoided through coordinated geoengineering, renewable energy adoption, and cross-continental water redistribution projects. The United States played a leading role in both technological and diplomatic coordination. 2195, AI-assisted predictive governance prevented a regional famine in South America, showing how U.S.-developed modeling and humanitarian strategies had become integral to global stability. By the century's end, historians characterized American power not as a measure of dominance, but as adaptive resilience. Influence had shifted from force to credibility, from unilateral action to cooperative frameworks, and from spectacle to steady, evidence-based governance. The Republic endured because it had internalized a critical lesson. True power is sustained not by conquest, but by responsibility, adaptability, and legitimacy. The narrative of American power, once framed as a rise and fall story, had evolved into a story of persistence, learning, and continuous adaptation. Citizens, institutions, and alliances had learned to navigate complexity, correct mistakes, and participate actively in governance. The Republic remained a living experiment in how a society could wield influence responsibly over centuries. Even as the 23rd century approached, the story remained unfinished, reminding future generations that power is never static, dominance is never guaranteed, and endurance requires constant engagement, reflection, and adaptation.